Welcome to the Silent Empires. Tonight, our story follows Lefty Ruggiero, the loyal soldier of the Bonanno crime family who lived by the old code of honor and respect. Known for his sharp wit, street knowledge, and unshakable loyalty, Lefty spent his life walking the fine line between friendship and duty. To some, he was a mentor and storyteller. To others, a reminder of a time when loyalty was everything and silence meant survival. Before we begin, like this video. We're aiming for 100 likes in this video. Don't forget to subscribe and join our family, and share your city and the time you're listening in the comments. Your support motivates us to keep bringing you more powerful stories. Now, close your eyes and imagine the quiet corners of Little Italy, the hum of late-night cafes, and the soft echo of a man's life lived in loyalty and loss. Settle in, and let the story of Lefty Ruggiero guide you into the night. Benjamin Ruggiero came up in a city that trained its kids to listen before speaking. He grew up close to the noise of pushcarts and tenement windows, where mothers hollered for dinner, and men in dark coats passed through social clubs with a nod that meant, keep walking. The neighborhood kept its own rhythm. School books shared space with pool cues and dice cups, and the quickest education came from watching the ways older guys solved problems. Money moved in small stacks and tight circles. A boy who could keep his mouth shut and his debts paid stood a better chance than one who dreamed of a corner office. He learned fast. First it was errands. Carry a package from one storefront to another, sweep a step, run a message during a card game without peeking at the cards. Then came the games themselves. Policy slips, numbers, the quiet clatter of dice in back rooms, the shorthand of odds and vig that never got written down in a school notebook. He used his left hand for everything: cards, a cigarette, the pen when he tallied a sheet, and Lefty simply fit. The two guns part drifted in later, a nod to habit and caution. In his world, caution kept you alive. He gravitated toward the Bonanno orbit, because that was the orbit that hung over the streets he walked. You didn't fill out an application. You stood around long enough, worked hard enough, showed you could be trusted, and the circle shifted to include you. Ruggiero walked into that circle as an earner, first as an associate. He learned from men a generation older, who had lived through lean years and knew how to squeeze a buck out of a bar stool. It wasn't about cinematic bravado. It was about taking bets without inviting cops, lending cash while keeping the borrower under a thumb, collecting without making a scene, and letting people know you were always there without ever saying so. His crimes were the daily kind that underpin organized rackets. He took wagers on sports and horses, ran bookmaking sheets, and managed the math so that the house didn't drown when a favorite came in. He did loan sharking, a clean word for lending money at sky-high interest with no paperwork and plenty of pressure. He shook down a handful of shops that paid protection, a steady tax dressed up as friendship, to keep problems from landing at their doors. He helped move stolen goods, especially jewelry, because gems and watches fit in small spaces and turned into cash, fast. He collected debts from people who fell behind, not by beating them senseless, but by showing up so often that falling behind stopped feeling like an option. If fear was needed, it arrived in quiet words and a fixed stare long before anyone raised a hand. That was a point of pride for him. Do enough without doing too much. From time to time, he got grabbed in sweeps for gambling, illegal betting, carrying a gun. Small charges, familiar handcuffs, a court date, a lawyer. In that era, a bookmaker might see a weekend sell and a fine, then go back to the routine by Monday afternoon. That pattern fed the illusion that the machine he worked in could keep turning without real consequence. Still, he knew the stakes were rising as the city changed and federal prosecutors learned to bundle street-level offenses into bigger conspiracy cases. More than anything else, he was a gambler. He loved the track, loved the idea that a horse could redeem a bad week with one well-timed sprint. That love could be a weakness. He'd win, then lose twice as big, then chase the loss. The habit dug holes that business had to fill. He owed, paid back, owed again. Among his own people, debts spoke louder than speeches. Falling behind didn't just mean trouble with bookmakers. It meant pressure from captains who expected tribute on time. The urgency to make money never let up, and it shaped the moves he made and the risks he took. He had a rough charm and an older man's patience. Younger associates were drawn to him because he knew the rules and the etiquette: how to carry yourself in a club, how to talk to a superior, what to say, and what to leave unsaid when a stranger bought a drink. He could be demanding, almost fatherly, then icy if you cut corners. Under the toughness, there was a code he believed in. Loyalty up and down. Don't bring heat to the door. Don't talk out of school. Keep the money flowing. Those ideas weren't printed on a card, but they framed his days like streetlights on the way home. He didn't carry the swagger of a headline maker. He was a soldier, an earner, a guy who showed up. Those ranks have responsibilities. Collect weekly envelopes, mediate small beefs, keep pressure on Shylock accounts, keep the peace inside a crew that spends long hours together. In Williamsburg, he found his regular seat at a bar and social club where his crew gathered. He linked up with Dominic, Sonny Black, Napolitano, a steady figure who ran a tight table. Around that table, Ruggiero's voice mattered because he could be counted on to bring cash, bring discipline, and keep ambition in check. He wasn't shy about reminding people that rules existed for reasons. The list of his illegal work reads like a ledger of urban vice. Sports betting, numbers, bookmaking, loans at criminal interest rates, extortion framed as help, fencing stolen rings and watches, occasional involvement in schemes around vending machines and jukeboxes that paid out to crews instead of owners. His pocket held 2 items most days: cigarettes and a small notebook full of names, amounts, due dates. He didn't need bruisers standing behind him. Steady pressure did the job. If someone stiffed him, he didn't rant. He stopped smiling and came back the next day, and the next, and the next, until the debt paid or the debtor realized a bigger problem would follow. He knew men who had done killings, and he told stories about past violence in a tone that made it sound routine. At times, he bragged about numbers that made younger guys' eyes widen. Whether every claim reflected plain fact or part bravado, the more important truth was this: he lived in a system where violence was a tool. He survived by understanding that tool while trying not to wave it around. He did not invite attention with public cruelty. He preferred a whisper to a shout. In a life measured by risk, the quiet choice often kept you breathing longer. The 1,960 seconds became the 1,970 seconds, and surveillance got smarter. Wiretaps grew common. Prosecutors studied ledgers and meetings. Old neighborhoods faced new pressure as family leaderships changed, alliances shifted, and ambitious men chased bigger rackets. Through all that noise, Lefty kept doing what he knew: earning, collecting, handling errands for more powerful names, holding on to his spot in a crew that fed him and demanded everything from him. He had a common law partner at home at times, kids to worry about, doctor bills, rent, the same ordinary stresses every working man faces, only his paycheck came in envelopes from back rooms. He liked to teach. If a younger associate asked how to dress for a sit-down, he corrected the tie, brushed lint off the shoulders, explained why you don't talk first, why you let a pause run before you reply to a pointed question. He had a way of showing what counted. You could tell he took pride in the role, passing along practical survival skills so that his crew didn't embarrass itself. His patience had limits, though. If someone cut in on a book without permission, or tried to skim tribute, or flashed money in a way that drew police, his patience turned into a cold look that froze the room. New York real estate and construction attracted money like a magnet, and crews sought slices of those pies. He wasn't a builder of skyscrapers, but he understood that unions and trucking and delivery had choke points. He took fees from those pressure points when he could, always cautious about who else had their hands in the same stream. He kept a map in his mind: whose bar belonged to which crew, which street belonged to which captain, where not to step without a phone call first. In that sense, he wasn't just a gambler. He was a cartographer of risk. He had brushes with authorities that reminded him the leash could tighten. Now and then, he'd be tailed out of a club, stopped for a search, written up for a pistol without paperwork. The city's cops knew his face. Federal agents started recognizing his voice. He'd crack a joke, stay calm, call a lawyer, and walk out again. Each exit taught the same lesson: be careful what you say, who you say it to, and where you stand when you say it. That pragmatism would matter later more than he could imagine. Beneath the craft, the debts kept nipping at his heels. The horses ran and stumbled, the weekends blurred, and the math sometimes turned cruel. That urgency nudged him toward bigger schemes and new territories. Florida, with its sunshine bars and open pockets, began to look like a place where a crew could expand operations, whether through gambling, nightclub investments, or loan business among transplants who missed their old neighborhood habits. He didn't rush. He weighed options, asked around, and watched for open lanes that didn't start a turf war. Ambition and caution had an uneasy partnership inside him. In those years, he earned the trust of men whose trust mattered. He became a go-between, sometimes a mentor, sometimes a collector, sometimes a messenger who could carry delicate news without twisting it. That stature wasn't the result of a single dramatic triumph. It came from repetition, from showing up clean and sharp, from remembering who liked his coffee black and who preferred cream, from never forgetting a due date or a name. In an economy built on memory, his memory was a bank. As the decade wound on, his path led him towards someone new, an eager ear who spoke his language and followed his rules. That meeting would feel like good fortune at first, a solution to debts and a boost to his status. It would also open a door he never saw coming, one that led straight to judges, headlines, and a hard reckoning with a system that had once felt like the only family that mattered. But before that storm broke, he was still a veteran of the shadows, still an earner with a left-handed grip on a cigarette and a notebook full of numbers, still walking home at dawn past a city that could swallow a man whole without anyone noticing. By the mid-1970s, the city's back rooms felt smaller because everyone seemed to be looking over a shoulder that made a new face stand out. The man who said his name was Donnie moved through bars and social clubs the way a careful mechanic moves through a garage, touching only what he needed. He said he hustled jewels, small pieces that changed hands for cash, no questions. Lefty listened, reserved at first, then curious. Jewelry was a smart lane because it packed value into a pocket and didn't spoil. If the stones checked out, you could turn them into money before sunrise. Donnie talked shop with the calm of someone who knew how a diamond catches light. Lefty put him through little tests. Bring something to a quiet table, let an older hand take a look, see how the kid reacts when asked where it came from. He watched for Tell's panic, bragging, lies that didn't line up. The kid stayed steady. That earned another call, then another meeting. The introduction came through Tony Mira, a fearsome figure in their world, which gave the new guy a foot in the door. But circles shift. Mira went away, as men did, and Lefty stepped up as the sponsor who kept the door open. A sponsor wasn't just a reference, it was a stake. If your guy made money, you looked smart. If he brought heat, you looked reckless. Lefty took that responsibility seriously because his reputation acted as a shield when he had to ask for a favor or push for a bigger slice. He started bringing Donnie around the Motion Lounge in Williamsburg, sunny black spot, where the crew's business mixed with neighborhood chatter. At the bar, Donnie kept quiet, watched, learned who to nod to, who to ignore. Lefty liked that. Most problems begin with loose lips. Money ruled the rhythm. Lefty ran books on sports, made side action on horses, floated cash at eye-watering interest, and took a piece from bars and vendors who knew the price of peace of mind. He bought and sold stolen rings, watches, chains, pieces that rolled through his network fast. None of it looked dramatic from the street. It looked like coffee, cigarettes, hushed conversations, and envelopes sliding between hands. Donnie fit into that flow as a steady supplier and apprentice, someone who could carry a message, drive a car, move an item, and never make himself the story. He learned to bring gifts, small favors that made older men feel seen. Lefty kept coaching him. How to sit at a table, how to answer a question with a pause, how to show respect without looking weak. The lessons weren't about romance or outlaw glamour. They were workplace training for an illegal economy. Donnie heard the commandments in simple phrases. Don't talk in a moving car if another car sits too close behind. Don't name a name when a nod will do. Always pay the phone bill in cash. Don't get loud in a place you might need tomorrow. Rackets were held together by trust and fear, and mishandling either would wreck your week. Lefty had spent years learning whom to approach for credit, where to store valuables, which doorways hid cameras, which payphones clicked when someone listened. That body of knowledge kept him free. He wanted the kid to absorb it the way a new driver learns to sense traffic without checking mirrors too often. Debts shadowed those days. Lefty's love for action at the track could crash a tidy ledger overnight. He'd walk into an off-track betting parlor like a pilgrim, then walk back out lighter or heavier depending on how the day went. Losses forced him to earn harder. That pressure shaped choices. Chase new customers, press slow payers, take a chance on a fresh scheme, Call a friend in Florida who said sunshine made people open their wallets. He never said he was desperate, but urgency lived under the surface, pushing him to keep the cash moving. Donnie saw that compulsion up close. It made Lefty human and dangerous at the same time, human because weakness showed. Dangerous because weakness in that world sparks risk. When Mira came back around, trouble followed. Who owned the right to claim Donnie? In their culture, a sponsor isn't just a mentor. He's the pipeline through which a man's tribute flows. Tribute mattered. It fed captains, which fed bosses, which fed the invisible debts that linked everyone. Mira argued Donnie belonged to him because of the original introduction. Lefty countered that he did the daily work, taught the rules, took the risk, handled the kids' earnings. That dispute wasn't a screaming match. It was a slow boil that lasted months, with jabs in doorways and phone calls that left tension hanging in the air. Sonny Black watched carefully. He valued earners more than talkers, and Lefty kept bringing full envelopes. That kept Donnie under Lefty's arm. Lefty looped Donnie into more business. They moved pieces of gold to fences who could handle heat. They ran illegal wagers in rooms that stayed dark long after legal closing time. They lent to guys who couldn't get bank loans and made sure those guys never forgot the due date. They pushed into vending routes, cigarette machines, jukeboxes, because little coins add up when you control placement. He taught Donnie the math of vigorish, the art of nudging a bettor to hedge, the way to judge if a borrower had a cousin who might help him pay, or a cousin who might cause a scene. Violence lurked as a last option, a silent threat rather than a plan. The goal was always the same: keep money flowing without drawing sirens. The bigger Mafia story that decade ran alongside their daily grind. Carmine Galante's murder in 1979 shook the Bonanno world and reset the seating chart. Power aligned around men who believed steadier hands should guide business. Sonny Black's stock rose. With that rise came opportunity for his crew to expand. Lefty felt that shift as a practical blessing. More territory to tap, more protection for his operations, more leverage to settle petty disputes. It also meant more scrutiny. When bosses rearrange chairs, underlings stand taller and get noticed by people who might prefer them shorter. Lefty understood the trade-off and told Donnie to be more careful than ever. Florida came into focus for them as both getaway and new frontier. The thinking ran straight. Tourists and transplants brought cash, bars stayed busy, and the culture of betting traveled south with people from New York. Donnie's supposed jewelry contacts could open doors in Tampa and around Clearwater. Sonny Black gave a green light. Lefty and Donnie traveled down to feel out opportunities in clubs where the air smelled like rum and ocean. They scoped a nightlife spot that looked perfect for skimming and soft extortion, the sort of place where a quiet partner could fix problems, keep the liquor coming, and dip a hand into the register without icy stares. They started to plant flags, meet the owner, float help, propose a security presence that really meant a steady tax, show they could move stolen goods quickly if someone needed a favor. There was friction almost immediately. Florida had its own history and its own hard men. And turf doesn't shift without pushback. A rival with local juice didn't appreciate outside attention. Meetings turned frosty. Names were dropped to remind people whose backyard they stood in. Back in Brooklyn, Lefty reported the prickly reception. The conversation grew darker. If a rival kept blocking them, there would be talk about removing the obstacle. In their world, that meant planning a murder. Donnie later told the full story under oath. Meetings to discuss a hit. Scoping routines. Picking a spot. Juggling who would do what? The FBI agents listening to tapes knew those plans were getting real. They tightened their net, and arrests started dropping in Florida before a life could be taken. No gore, no shootouts on the evening news, just a federal hand reaching in to stop a spiral. That intervention kept a target alive and added more weight to the case piling up in New York. Daily routines continued, because routines keep a crew fed even when big schemes stall. Lefty collected Shylock payments on Mondays and Thursdays, knowing those were days when people got paid and excuses ran out. He checked with bookies after big games to see if the line moved right. He walked the motion lounge floor, absorbing gossip that sounded harmless but helped him map alliances. Who had started drinking with whom? Who had changed cars? who had smiled too hard at a joke told by the wrong person. In that environment, social clues functioned like weather reports. A sudden chill might signal a storm. Donnie kept rising in Lefty's estimation. The older man vouched for him in bigger rooms. He pitched the idea that the kid could be formally brought into the family, an extraordinary gesture for someone with no blood tie to Sicily and no decades-long pedigree. The pitch reflected how much money Donnie seemed to generate and how loyal he behaved when cops showed up or a conversation veered into delicate history. Sonny Black took the suggestion seriously. The thought of opening the books for Donnie stirred resentment in some corners, but envy often tracks money. If a man made envelopes fat, room got made for him. Arrests punctuated those years like commas. A gambling pinch here, a weapons bust there. Lefty treated them as fees for doing business. He'd call a lawyer, make bail, return to the club, and talk about food while they waited for updates. But federal attention was changing. Investigators had learned to frame their cases not as isolated bets or single guns, but as a pattern called racketeering, a web of illegal acts tied to a person and a crew. The tapes from Donnie helped weave that web. On them, Lefty's voice laid out percentages, schedules, threats spoken softly, the names of people who owed or paid. He wasn't boasting to impress a stranger. He was instructing someone he thought was his apprentice. That difference made the recordings even more credible. Inside the crew, relationships deepened. Lefty confided family troubles. He had kids, bills, problems with a longtime partner who didn't love the unpredictability of a life spent walking into rooms where plans changed by the hour. He wasn't a movie villain. He was a working man inside an illegal system, stubborn, proud, often funny, sometimes bitter, always convinced that loyalty deserved loyalty. He nudged Donnie to check in with his mother, to bring groceries to a girlfriend, to send a little something to someone who had taken a fall. On holidays, he tried to buy gifts that showed he remembered details, not just dollar signs. None of that erased the damage his business model caused. Borrowers bled under interest that could never be cleared without a miracle. Stores paid protection that ate profit they could have used to hire staff. Bettors who couldn't stop lost more than money. They lost peace at home. Lefty knew those costs existed and compartmentalized them. He told himself he provided structure where chaos would otherwise win, that he solved problems in neighborhoods where official help arrived late or not at all. That justification let him sleep. Even as he hounded a man who missed a payment, or leaned on a scared bartender for a bigger weekly envelope. By 1980, the stakes for the Bonannos climbed. Internal fractures, old debts, and external pressure set the stage for the bloodshed that would later rock the family. Lefty felt tremors in small ways, whispers that certain captains met too often without telling the rest, sudden absences, new faces tailing cars. He told Donnie to keep plans flexible, to carry less chatter in a single day, to walk away from a table if the mood shifted in a way he couldn't explain. Those instincts had kept him afloat for decades. He trusted them over gossip. One day he looked at Donnie across a table in the motion lounge and said something close to a blessing. "You did good for me. You brought in real money. You kept your mouth shut. You showed me respect." That was as close to affection as he'd allow in public. He talked about the future like it was already arranged. A ceremony that would make the kid part of a world most men only heard about in rumors. A pathway to his own crew someday, small as it might be at first. Lefty pictured himself as the veteran who would stand next to the younger man during that step, proud that his judgment had been right. The irony landed hard later. The person he trusted most outside his own family wasn't who he said he was. Through no fault of his neighborhood schooling, through no missing homework in the school of the streets, Lefty had guided an undercover agent straight into the heart of a crew he had spent a lifetime protecting. He couldn't see that yet. He still believed he had chosen well, found a partner who made up for bad bets and light weeks, a student who would carry his nickname into the next decade. He still moved through the city with a left-handed flick of ash and a habit of counting debts without looking down at the paper. Business rolled on. Shylock accounts, bookmaking, extortion under the name of security, stolen jewelry changing hands, silent pressure on vending routes, schemes around union trucking where a few phone calls could speed a delivery or slow it to a crawl. Each move came with risk he thought he knew how to manage. Each risk was now recorded, cross-referenced, and filed under a federal case number he didn't know existed. The curtain had not dropped yet, but the cords were in place. The crew still joked at the bar, still argued over which quarterback couldn't handle the cold, still ate pasta like it was medicine for bad weeks. Lefty smiled when cash hit his palm and frowned when the phone rang too early in the morning. He was still the soldier he had always been, stubbornly loyal to a way of living that had kept him fed and kept him on a narrow path between profit and ruin. When he walked out into winter air after closing, the city kept its secrets for him. He didn't know that files in another building already carried his name on thick folders. He didn't know that the man lighting a cigarette beside him had a second life that would soon end theirs as they knew it. He only knew his rules, his routines, his debts, and the satisfaction of a well-run day. The next turns would be brutal in their clarity. Family wars, betrayals from inside, sudden disappearances, courtroom lights. For the moment, he still believed a steady hand could steer through anything. He had made it this far by trusting his read of people. He believed that Reed would carry him a little farther still. Spring crept in with cold mornings and talk that felt heavier than usual. Names that had sat at nearby tables for years started getting framed as problems instead of partners. A split had grown inside the Bonanno world, old friends turning into rivals over money, territory, and pride. Lefty heard it first as murmurs in doorways, then as clear instructions spoken in rooms where only trusted people Saturday. The message was blunt. The family couldn't carry two visions at once. Meetings were set, promises were made, and behind those promises sat plans that left no room for compromise. When the dust settled, 3 high-ranking men were gone, and the balance of power shifted toward the crew that included Sonny Black. No speeches, no headlines with grand explanations, just a chilling reminder that in their system, disagreements didn't end with handshakes. On the street, bars opened as usual, trains kept running, and people bought groceries. Inside clubs, seating charts changed in a single afternoon. Lefty took the shift as both warning and validation. He had backed his captain, and now carried the weight that comes with winning. That meant more responsibility, more envelopes to collect, and sharper eyes watching him from above. He told Donnie to be smarter than ever. Appearances mattered. You arrived on time, you dressed clean, you kept your voice low, and you handled errands without drawing strangers' attention. The success of their side didn't erase practical realities. The track still called to him like a siren. He'd cash a strong week, then drop a hunk of it on a horse that looked good, convincing himself that one score could clear a ledger. Losses brought pressure, and pressure had a smell that everyone in that room could identify. He wore it like aftershave. It made him work harder, but it also nudged him toward bigger ideas. Those months tightened his bond with Donnie. The talk about opening the books for the younger man got serious in rooms that had never considered an outsider worthy. That wasn't about romance or some oath whispered in Latin. It was about numbers and discipline. Donnie seemed to make money appear in reliable ways. He kept his mouth shut when cops came around. He showed deference without acting needy. Lefty treated it like a personal project, a chance to prove his judgment in front of men who could make or break a career. He stood up for Donnie against anyone who tried to cut in. Tony Mira still floated around the edges, pushing the claim that the kid belonged to him, but practical life has a way of turning arguments into math. Lefty did the daily supervision and brought in tribute. That counted more than origin stories. The Florida lane hadn't closed. Sunshine brought out wallets and lowered defenses, and the transplant pipeline kept flooding Tampa and surrounding towns with people who understood the rules of backroom business. Lefty and Donnie continued laying groundwork there. Small investments in nightlife, talk about security that translated into influence over a register, quick turnovers of gold and diamonds for cash that never hit a bank. They built quiet leverage with bar owners who appreciated problems getting solved faster than police could manage. The rivalry they ran into earlier didn't disappear. It cooled, then flared, the way turf questions do when pride outweighs profit. Meetings carried an edge. The language sounded polite, but everyone at the table recognized the undertone. Plans to remove an obstacle gathered shape. Lefty didn't race toward that solution, but he understood the logic that governed his world. If someone blocked a profitable lane and refused to adjust, a permanent fix got discussed. Those conversations were captured on microphones planted by the government. In later testimony, agents described lists, times, and roles being juggled. No gore, no theatrical threats, just low voices arranging a violent outcome. Before anyone took a step that couldn't be recalled, Arrests hit Florida. The move made clear that law enforcement had found a way to get inside. The shock traveled north ahead of the agents who flew back with their files. For people in Lefty's circle, the news didn't just mean a spoiled plan. It meant questions about how much else had been heard. Back in New York, the avalanche gathered speed. The internal war had taken heads. Now the federal push would take bodies into custody. Lefty stuck to routine, as if routine could hold the roof up. Collect on Monday and Thursday, talk margins with bookies midweek, keep pressure on Shylock accounts, make sure the slot where his jukebox sat stayed his slot. In the motion lounge, Sonny Black moved like a man whose table had grown heavier. He carried authority quiet and flat. He signaled that indiscretion would get punished faster than ever. Lefty took the cue and pulled Donnie even closer. The thought of seeing the kid formally sworn in started to feel like destiny. The moment that shattered that plan arrived without dramatic music. The FBI ended the undercover operation, not because business was dry, but because the agent had been tapped to take part in a murder that the Bureau could not allow to happen. The extraction happened fast. Phones rang, doors opened, and the truth landed like a hammer. Donnie Brasco Joseph Pistone, in his real life, wasn't a jewel thief. He wasn't someone's nephew testing his luck. He was an agent who had lived alongside them for years, recording conversations that put names and numbers on a board in a federal office. The revelation traveled through the family with the force of a storm. Trust evaporated in minutes. People who had been sure of their read on a man realized they had been playing cards with a deck they didn't understand. The consequences arrived in swift, cold steps. Sonny Black paid with his life. He had brought Donnie into inner rooms, vouched for him, pushed for him to cross a line that can't be uncrossed. Inside their culture, that mistake erased years of disciplined work. He was summoned to meet, didn't return, and the message was clear to everyone who counted chair legs in social clubs the next day. Lefty was next in line for punishment. He had mentored Donnie, defended him, and used his name to navigate rooms where introductions carry a price. A call came instructing Lefty to report. He knew what that usually meant. He put on clean clothes, got his things in order, and headed out the door. Before he reached the destination, agents intercepted him. They weren't there as friends. They had a warrant and a case file thick enough to keep him alive by keeping him off the street. The charges read like a catalog of the life he had lived. Racketeering under RICO tied together loan sharking, illegal gambling, extortion framed as protection, dealing in stolen jewelry, and a conspiracy to commit murder related to Florida plans that had been stopped. Years of tape wrapped around his days like a net. Prosecutors didn't need to dramatize. They could play recordings in which he explained percentages, timetables, who owed what, and how pressure works when someone misses a payment. They had phone records, ledgers, small notebooks, and witnesses who could place him in rooms at specific hours. On top of that, co-defendants with lighter stomachs for prison looked for deals. The case didn't hinge on a single risky witness. It had the weight of routine, everyday transactions stacked until they looked like a staircase. He refused to cooperate. That wasn't stubbornness for its own sake. It was identity. In his world, talking to save yourself meant you lost yourself. Friends tried to nudge him toward a softer stance. Lawyers explained calculations involving sentencing ranges and guidelines. He listened, thanked them, and kept his answer simple. He would fight the case at trial where he could, and if he lost, he would serve. That decision turned the rest of his life into a narrow corridor. Out on bail at times, back in on remand, moving through courthouses that smelled of coffee and paper, he watched years of careful routine get pulled apart in front of strangers wearing suits. The courtroom sessions made clear how deeply the undercover work had penetrated daily life. Jurors heard his voice describing the math of a book. They heard him detail collections without raising a hand, the way presence and persistence can accomplish what fists might, how borrowers grow quiet when a collector sits at a table and refuses to leave. They heard about deliveries to fences and the way stones and gold can glide through a city if you know who buys on sight. The prosecutors were careful to draw a line. This wasn't a story about 2 or 3 bad nights. It was an ongoing enterprise with rules, seniority, and recognized roles. The defense pushed back, pointing out bravado layered into old men's talk, and reminding anyone listening that words don't always match action. It was a tough climb against stacks of tape. While hearings ran, the streets kept their pace. Tony Mira, the man whose introduction had opened the door for Donnie in the first place, didn't survive the reckoning. He was murdered months after the operation went public, a result widely understood as retribution for dragging a catastrophe into rooms that should have been sealed. Changes kept rolling through the Bonanno chart. People vanished, others moved seats, and new bosses gripped handles that had burned earlier hands. Lefty couldn't steer any of it. He was a passenger in a system that measured men by how they handled pressure. He handled it the only way he knew: remain quiet, keep his answers crisp, let his lawyer do the talking, and focus on what he could control: his body, his mind, and his memory. A federal sentence followed. The length was significant enough to remove him from the city's pulse for years. He went into custody, older than most men who line up for chow the first week. Cigarettes had carved their mark into his lungs and throat long before he saw his cell. Inside, he found a different economy layered on top of uniforms and counts. He kept to a routine that made sense. Wake early, read newspapers front to back, walk laps when he could, keep his personal space tidy, write letters to the few people who still wrote back. He didn't pretend he wasn't a prisoner. He accepted it and tried to make the hours add up to something other than noise. Family remained a thread that tied him to the outside. He had children to worry about, and worries have a way of growing in silence. Visits came with plexiglass and worn phones, then with handshakes when rules allowed. He offered guidance the only way he knew. Simple advice about money, living within means, staying away from people who talk too big. He didn't brag about the old days. He didn't polish his resume. Time in a cell dulls appetite for nostalgia. What he missed was small. Walking out of a bar just before dawn, the feeling of a winter breeze against warm cheeks, a coffee poured by someone who knew his order, neighborhood faces that put his mind at ease. Outside those walls, the Donnie Brasco story turned into a sensation. Newspaper features explained how an agent had slipped into a Mafia family for years. A book laid out the operation in full. Later, a film turned private rooms into movie scenes. The public learned names and habits that used to exist only as rumors. Inside, Lefty processed that attention on his own time. He lived with the knowledge that he had been fooled, not by a brash con man, but by a professional trained to listen better than anyone he had ever met. He had taught the agent etiquette he thought sacred. He had given him access earned over decades. Accepting that truth became part of his sentence. Illness crept in and became a daily companion. Years of smoking turned coughs into medical charts. He received treatment as options allowed. Scans, pills, visits to prison clinics, where fluorescent lights buzzed and time stretched even thinner. He slowed down, but he didn't let self-levity take the wheel. He still pressed for news from home, asked after old friends even when those friends' names had been erased by silence, and kept track of birthdays. He marked holidays with whatever small rituals were permitted. A better coffee, a longer phone call, a short prayer said under his breath for people he loved and people he couldn't forgive. He never rewrote his past to make himself a folk hero. In quiet moments, he admitted to mistakes. Gambling that spun out of control, trust placed in the wrong person, an inability to step away from a life that punished anyone who stayed too long. He also wouldn't let strangers define him solely by a courtroom narrative. He believed he had lived by a code that made sense in the world he knew. Loyalty, consistency, and keeping your word even when it hurt. Those ideas don't clean a ledger, but they explain why he chose the path he chose when easier options were put on the table. The fallout from the undercover operation reshaped more than one family. Arrests, trials, and reorganizations set a different tone on New York streets. The old habit of handling every dispute in-house lost ground to a reality where microphones might sit in ashtrays and cameras might live behind a light bulb. Younger men started to consider quieter careers. Some stayed and adapted to a new landscape with smaller footprints and relentless caution. Lefty heard that shift through letters and stories from visitors. He understood that his era was closing, and that he had been one of the cautionary examples used to teach a new generation what to avoid. By the time his case settled into the rhythm of appeals and denials, he had grown used to moving through days with measured steps. He found peace where he could. In a well-told story shared at a table, in a sports score that landed just right, in a memory that made him smile without pretending the past was softer than it had been. The man who once counted debts by touch learned to count blessings the same way quietly, one at a time, without advertising. He knew that one day he would walk back into the city that had defined him. He didn't fool himself into expecting parades or open arms. He expected a smaller life, a more private routine, the freedom to wake up without a guard yelling count. He focused on reaching that day in one piece. Somewhere in the middle of the noise, the stubborn earner who had moved through bars and back rooms with a left-handed cigarette learned to measure success by simpler metrics. A letter in the mail, a doctor's report that didn't get worse, a good night's sleep. The next chapter would arrive, not with neon and jukeboxes, but with a front door that opened to a quieter street and air that didn't smell like courtrooms. He could trace every turn that brought him there. He had chosen each step with eyes open, convinced at the time that he understood the risk. The trap he never saw was the one that walked beside him, asked good questions, drove him across bridges, and listened as he explained rules he thought would protect him. That irony never left. It sat with him like a guest who outstayed his welcome, an inescapable reminder that the sharpest lesson of his life arrived disguised as a student. He carried that lesson forward as the calendar moved, a kind of hard wisdom that didn't forgive but did clarify. He was a soldier who had survived a storm that drowned men stronger than he was. The city he loved kept turning, the track kept running horses he would never bet again, and he settled in to do the most disciplined work of his lifetime. Wait, reckon, and prepare for the day when a gate would open and a guard would say his name without adding a number. The calendar inside moved slow, but news still reached him through papers, TV in the day room, and voices that carried updates with the casual tone of men who had learned to hide nerves. He figured out how to turn routine into armor. Wake early before the tier got loud. Clean the small space like it mattered. Read every page of every section, even the classifieds, because patterns hide in small type too. Walk laps until the guards told them to stop. Keep to a diet that didn't wreck his gut. Keep cigarettes close, even as doctors warned about what they had already done. He didn't pretend prison was school. It was a place where you survived by shrinking your signature, where talking less earned more safety than talking tough. His case sat like a weight in a drawer that only opened when lawyers came. The list of counts had been built from years of daily habits, taking wagers without a license, coordinating bookmaking sheets with other men, lending cash with interest set far above the law, pressuring slow payers to get back on schedule, moving stolen jewelry from hand to hand so it disappeared from inventories, carrying a pistol because in his world, that counted as common sense. The Florida piece added conspiracy to kill, based on recorded conversations around a stubborn obstacle. He had made those calls, sat at those tables, used the code that masks specifics while still landing the message. Now the recordings played in rooms where code meant nothing. In court, his calm voice became evidence, not a sign of experience. He told the lawyer straight. He wouldn't switch sides. The attorney, a careful man who had seen plenty, laid out calculus involving potential plea deals, scenarios that trimmed years off in exchange for cooperation. Lefty listened, nodded, put a cigarette out slow, and said he couldn't do it. To many people outside his world, that stance looked foolish. To him, it was the only way to live with himself. If he couldn't control the sentence, he could still control the kind of man he was while serving it. Inside, he adjusted to a new hierarchy that didn't care about neighborhood legends. Some inmates knew his name from the papers and tried to cozy up. He kept distance. Others disliked that kind of attention and watched him in case he brought heat. He showed them with his quiet that he wasn't running a production. He wasn't a preacher, but he still had an urge to teach basics to younger men who were chewing glass and didn't know how to stop. He told them to read more, write letters to people they missed, keep their heads down when boredom pushed them toward fights that changed nothing. It didn't make him popular. It made him useful. The undercover story grew into a public phenomenon while he wore khakis. The book describing the operation arrived in mailrooms and floated around common areas. People read it the way they read thrillers. He read it as a man recognizing his reflection in a cracked mirror. There were scenes he remembered like they had happened yesterday. There were details that surprised him, bits of tradecraft he had never suspected, while the agent sat across from him eating pasta at a back table. He didn't throw the book. He closed it, put it down, and walked laps again until the urge to curse went away. He thought about Sonny Black often. The captain had been practical and steady, not an actor but a working boss who valued results over posture. Lefty had counted on that sensibility to steer them through reorganization after the earlier boss fell. When the truth about Donnie hit, Sonny's past steady hand didn't save him. In their world, responsibility flows downhill and crushes whoever it lands on. The death shook Lefty in a way he didn't broadcast. Losing a leader you respect hits hard even if you saw it coming. He kept the grief private, the way he kept everything private now. His own discipline had cracks. Smoking wasn't a habit anymore. It was a part of him. Years of breathing deep on the way to a track, a club, a sit-down had carved grooves that the clinic couldn't sand smooth. He coughed more. Doctors shook their heads, wrote new prescriptions, told him to slow down. He agreed during visits and lit up again later. Old patterns are stubborn, even inside. Letters became a lifeline. He wrote to his kids with a different tone than the one he used in bars. He was honest about money ways that weren't working for him or for the family. He recommended steady jobs, low expectations for quick scores, patience with small wins. He didn't pretend to be a saint. He said he had chased too many long shots at racetracks and across poker tables. He wrote apologies that didn't overreach. A man who has pressed debtors his entire life learns to choose words carefully when he's the one trying to rebuild trust. From the outside, the arc of the Bonanno organization bent into a new shape. The commission case hit other families hard, and the infiltrators' tapes had carved a hole in the Bonanno map. Arrests rolled through the early 80s, then the mid-decade years, then the late ones. Old faces disappeared. New names rose. Some men chose to cooperate, moving to new lives under assumed names, trading community for safety. He read those headlines with a blank look. He understood the costs of every option and accepted the one he had picked. Not every memory was dark. He could still picture Brooklyn mornings when the sun hit brick in a way that made the street look soft. He remembered jokes told by a bartender with perfect timing, deli coffee in a paper cup that warmed his hand on winter walks, quiet moments with his partner, when the world outside felt like it had been put on pause. Those images weren't nostalgia for the crimes. They were affection for the human spaces around the crimes. The small rituals that give a person a home, even when the address changes. He spent nearly a decade moving through the federal system. Transfers came without warning. One day you had a routine. The next day you were in a van headed to a new yard. He made himself adaptable. If the new spot had a decent library, he lost himself in old newspapers. If it had a walking track, he wore it out. If it had a decent kitchen job, he took it because familiarity with a set of tasks kept his mind calm. He never tried to rebuild a crew inside or flex old muscles. That wasn't about fear. It was about age and wisdom. He wanted quieter days that ended with sleep rather than adrenaline. By the early 90s, his health forced decisions he couldn't delay. Doctors found lung cancer and began treatments that stripped him of energy. He soldiered through as best he could. A parole board looked at the file with the new medical section and made a practical decision. Compassion and budget both pushed toward the same conclusion when a prisoner grows truly sick. He was released to finish his fight in the outside world. Freedom arrived without fanfare. No salutes, no parade. Just a door opening and a new set of rules to follow carefully if he wanted to keep that door from closing. Re-entry for an older man with notoriety felt like stepping onto a sidewalk that had been repaved while he was gone. He found the city louder in some ways and colder in others. Faces changed, storefronts flipped, social clubs took on a different tone. Many shuddered under the weight of lawsuits, raids, and rules. He moved into a small place and learned a slower rhythm. He went to medical appointments, took pills that made food taste wrong, tried to sleep when coughing let him. He followed parole conditions, kept appointments, answered questions without volunteering extra words. He knew the price of getting casual. He wanted simple things now. He wanted to sit in a chair by a window and watch street life without becoming part of it. He wanted decent coffee in the morning and somebody to laugh with once in a while about old movies or a ball game. He didn't chase action. He didn't have energy to chase anything. When people approached him about the book or the story everyone knew, he stayed polite and kept moving. He wasn't a storyteller on command. He had already given too much of himself away in conversations that ended up on tape. He still followed news about the life he had left in a practical way. Not with longing, but with the curiosity of a craftsman watching an industry shift. He read about how the family rebuilt, how new captains shuffled money differently, how clubs got replaced by quieter fronts, how young earners balanced hustle with a constant awareness that microphones hide in every object that sits on a table. He shook his head sometimes at brazen stunts pulled by guys who hadn't learned restraint. He also smiled at small successes, like someone running a clean loan shop inside a legal business so quietly that even neighbors didn't suspect. He appreciated competence wherever it lived. The Donnie Brasco project kept growing in the culture. A film moved into development. He heard about casting and shrugged. Actors and lights interested him less than family dinners he could finally attend for an hour without asking permission weeks in advance. People asked him if he would watch it when it came out. He said he didn't know. The truth was he carried the story in his bones and didn't need a screen to tell it back to him. Money remained a puzzle he worked daily, minus the illegal edges that had defined his 30s and 40s. Medical bills come fast. He relied on help from people who remembered him as a human being long before they knew his name from a headline. He accepted help without pride, swallowing his gratitude. He had learned to say thank you without padding the sentence with excuses. He tried to fix small broken pieces from the past. He called people he had let down. He mailed notes for birthdays he had missed while wearing khaki. He asked about grandchildren and school plays. He avoided arguments about decisions that belonged to another era. If someone needed an apology, he offered one. If they needed distance, he granted it. He didn't use his illness to demand forgiveness. What he didn't do was reinvent himself as a harmless uncle who had stumbled into trouble. He understood exactly what he had been. He had collected debts that hurt people. He had profited from gambling addictions and fear. He had enforced silence in shops that could have used a louder voice. He treated that recognition as part of being an adult. There was no point pretending the past was a misunderstanding. The best he could do with the time he had left was to harm no one new and leave gentler footprints. Old friends a shrinking group visited when they could. Some survivors from the crew came by, older, thicker around the waist, wary in ways that never go away. Conversation moved around landmines. They skipped names that didn't feel safe to say. They talked about food and baseball, about a bar that used to serve the best linguine on a corner now occupied by a boutique. The rhythm felt familiar, and he treasured those afternoons even when they ended early because fatigue had its own boss. He didn't plan beyond the next few weeks. He set small goals. Keep an appointment, finish a book, call a daughter, and ask about a new job. Make it to a bench in a park for a half hour of Sunday. He had spent years scheming months ahead, mapping revenue streams that depended on 10 people doing their part. This shorter horizon felt honest. It matched the body he now moved around the apartment. A federal agent once said that what struck him most about Lefty wasn't menace but steadiness. That steadiness served him here too. He kept a dignified posture in bleak rooms with fluorescent lights and bad magazines. He made nurses laugh when they had nothing to laugh about. He didn't flirt with miracle cures. He took his medicine and accepted that some mornings would be bad. On better mornings, he shaved carefully and put on a shirt with buttons, as if to remind himself that he was still the man who noticed lint on a collar before walking into a room. People sometimes romanticize the idea of a code, turning it into poetry that launders the damage. He didn't do that. He hung on to the pieces that made sense. Keep your word. Carry yourself with respect. Don't turn in the people who fed you, and don't act like your troubles are unique. Those principles didn't absolve him. They gave him a way to move through the last stretch of his time with fewer knots in his chest. When he went out for air, he chose quiet streets. He recognized fewer faces each month. Time had thinned the neighborhood, the way it thins everything. A few times, someone would stop him and say they knew his name from a book jacket. He would nod, say he was trying to stay healthy, and keep walking. He didn't need to replay the greatest hits. He had already heard every verse. He had lived most of his life on the edge between money and trouble. In this final stretch, he chose smaller balances, a cup of coffee that tasted right, a day without bad news, a phone call that ended with a laugh. He knew that whatever reputation he carried would outlast him and get reshaped by storytellers. He couldn't control that. He could control how he spent his remaining energy. He gave it to people rather than schemes, to conversations that ended in kindness rather than leverage. The man who once wore out pavement between social clubs now measured distance in short hallway walks to the kitchen and back. He didn't flinch at this reduction. It felt like honest math. Years of burning both ends had brought him to a single flame he could keep steady in a room that didn't need neon to glow. He had made choices, paid prices, and outlived some who had seemed larger than life. He was still here, in a smaller frame, with lessons he would never write down but tried to live in each interaction. Be direct, be decent when you can, and know when to keep your mouth shut. He tried to make the outside feel manageable. Mornings turned into a ritual. Wash up slow, swallow a handful of pills, fold the newspaper across his knee, circle dates for appointments, and look out the window long enough to remember he was home. He didn't chase headlines. They came to him anyway. The Brasco book kept selling, and reporters called people who had once sat near him to ask what kind of man he was. Strangers built theories from a handful of details. He let them. He had work closer to hand, staying alive, minding parole, and keeping his circle small enough that trouble couldn't find an open seat. He still took pride in doing things the right way, even when right meant simple housekeeping. If a neighbor needed help carrying groceries, he stepped in. If a nurse asked him to show up early for blood work, he got there with time to spare. He had spent decades judging other men by whether they showed up as promised. He judged himself by the same standard now. A life shrinks when illness takes over. But small promises still count. He wore that idea like a jacket when the air turned cold. People asked if he felt angry about the undercover operation. The question missed the point. Anger doesn't fix anything in his world. He focused on the rule he had broken without knowing it. Never forget that anyone can be playing a longer game. He had taught that rule to younger guys. He had lived by it. He still believed he could read a room better than most. Yet he had vouched for a man whose ears belonged to the government. That reality sat heavy, but didn't turn into bitterness. He couldn't change the past. He could tell himself the truth about it and move on without whining. He didn't pretend he hadn't chosen crime. He had built his income from betting slips, Shylock vig, pressure dressed up as favors, and quick flips of stolen rings. Court papers listed those acts as counts under federal law. He recognized each one like a familiar street. He had lived the details. The way an odds line moves after a quarterback tweak, the quiet of a back room where a borrower counts bills with shaking hands, the practiced tone of a collector who wants payment today without knocking over tables. Those choices kept him fed and got him caught. That's a clean ledger, even when the numbers aren't pretty. He heard that people argued over whether he had ever put his hands on anyone. He didn't give that debate oxygen. He knew when the mere possibility of violence had done the job, when a word in the right ear or an unbroken stare made a late payer reach into his pocket. He also knew that in his world, violence never sat far from the table. Plans to kill had passed through rooms he occupied. Florida had nearly turned fatal before agents stepped in. Friends had vanished. Bosses had paid with their lives for backing the wrong play. Anyone who pretended otherwise was telling fairy tales. He didn't polish it or dramatize it. He accepted it, then turned back to his medicine schedule. On good days, he took walks to remind himself how many corners of the city he had known. Williamsburg blocks where the Motion Lounge had set the tone for a decade. Old haunts in Little Italy where coffee tasted like memory. The edges of Queens where bookies kept a low profile and deliveries got made without a fuss. He understood the maps had been redrawn by raids, lawsuits, and changing tastes. Social clubs turned into storefront churches or boutiques. Jukebox lanes gave way to digital playlists. And numbers runners got replaced by state lotteries and apps on phones he didn't want to learn. He didn't spin that into loss. The city always rewrites itself. He had written his chapter, paid for it, and kept moving. Sometimes he met people who thought they knew him from a movie that didn't exist yet. Casting rumors floated through magazines. He smiled at the idea of actors practicing his habits. The film people would ask consultants about handshakes, table etiquette, and the cadence of a man who worked for a living without a W-2. He hoped they got the small things right. The pause before answering a loaded question. The way a collector never raises his voice in a place he expects to visit again. The understanding that glamour doesn't pay the electric bill. He knew he might not see the premiere. That didn't bother him. He had already watched the only version that mattered. He took calls from old friends who had survived the storms. The conversation stayed clean. They talked about bad backs, good sauce, grandchildren who could sing, and the Mets breaking hearts again. Once in a while, a memory surfaced about a week nobody could forget. A horse that shouldn't have placed but did. A jukebox route that finally turned profitable. A sit-down that ended in a handshake when it could have ended badly. They didn't name names that had gone cold. They treated the past like a fragile plate handled carefully, or not at all. He spent time thinking about what being made had given him, and what it had taken. On the plus side, it had given him steady position, a clear chain of command, and a sense that he belonged to something bigger than himself. On the minus side, it had locked him into obligations that never end, and punishments that arrive without appeal. He had known that bargain when he shook hands years earlier. People outside his circle often imagine blind loyalty driven by ignorance. He saw it as informed consent. You join, you learn the rules, you accept the costs, and you stop expecting fairness. He had always found jewelry to be the cleanest hustle because it traveled easy and didn't lose value overnight. He remembered the rhythm with a kind of craftsman's nostalgia. A piece would arrive wrapped in paper and tape. A trusted eye would check stones, assess metal, and set a number that left room for profit. A call would go out to a fence who liked certain cuts and certain sizes. The same night, cash returned. It felt neat compared to collecting on a Shylock account that dragged for months. He never confused neatness with innocence. He knew somebody had been robbed upstream. He rationalized it as part of an ecosystem he didn't invent, one he navigated with as little noise as possible. Parole rules didn't let him drift. He checked in, answered questions, submitted to tests, and kept a log of his whereabouts when told to. A slip could send him back. He took that seriously. He had no appetite for another cot and another fluorescent bulb humming until morning. If he went to a diner, he picked a quiet one in a neighborhood where nobody cared who he was. If he went to a funeral, he stood at the back and left early. If he ran into someone from the old life, he nodded and kept sentences short. He wasn't playing coy. He was staying free. Money stayed tight. He did what men do when work dries up and bills don't. Downsize, negotiate, and ask for help when pride threatens to ruin practicality. Friends chipped in. Family stepped up. He sold things he didn't need. He learned to live inside a smaller number. He measured good days by how easily he could breathe, and whether he made it through without a call from a doctor's office asking him to come in earlier than scheduled. Stories about him in glossy magazines painted in bold strokes. The nickname, the mentor role, the tapes, the Nero miss with a fatal order, the arrest that turned into a rescue. He recognized himself in some lines, and not in others. He wasn't a philosopher king or a clown. He was a working criminal who specialized in revenue streams that didn't make the evening news unless something went wrong. He had survived by being meticulous, not merciless. He wished that point traveled better in print. Sensational stories sell faster, so nuance gets lost. He didn't lose sleep over it. He caught himself giving advice to younger family members that sounded like cautionary slogans. Don't gamble with next month's rent. Don't take a loan you can't explain to yourself in the mirror. Don't mistake loud men for strong men. Don't treat fear as a plan. He knew he hadn't lived by all of those lines when he was their age. He hoped repetition might make a difference for them. If not, time would teach the lesson without his help. News from the streets still reached him, often couched in harmless gossip. There had been reorganizations, quieter money, and a cultural shift toward fronts that looked like legitimate businesses with just enough margin to hide old habits. He appreciated competence wherever it lived. He disliked showboating because it wasted everyone's time. He smiled when he heard about a young earner who returned, borrowed money with interest on the exact day promised. That was the kind of detail that used to make his week. He thought often about the way investigators had turned patience into a lever. The undercover agent had built trust one coffee at a time. Wiretaps had listened, not for big threats, but for ordinary schedules and due dates. Prosecutors had stacked everyday acts into a ladder they could climb in front of a jury. That approach upended an old assumption, that if you kept violence low and noise lower, you could run for decades without a serious case sticking. After Brasco, that assumption broke. The new rule became simpler. Assume someone listening can hear even what you don't say. He wished some young men had learned that rule faster. As summer turned into another fall, his body insisted on slower days. He measured walks by blocks rather than miles. He took naps without apology. He kept appointments even when they felt like tests he didn't study for. He brought small kindness with him to those rooms. A joke for a tech drawing blood. A thank you to a receptionist who squeezed him in. Patience with delays that come with crowded clinics. He had lived loud enough earlier. Now he wanted to leave behind a thin trail of decency. He knew his own end wasn't far. The doctors didn't sugarcoat it. Treatment could stretch time, but not rewrite the script. He put his affairs in order the way he put a Shylock ledger in order. Names, amounts, what he owed and who owed him. Apologies he would never collect. He made peace, where peace could be made. He respected distances where bridges had burned too thoroughly to be rebuilt. He didn't hold grudges because grudges take energy he needed for breathing. He allowed himself one indulgence, a stretch of afternoon spent listening to a ball game with the window open, city noise mixing with play-by-play. Sports had always provided him with clean math, wins, losses, averages, streaks. Life rarely offers such tidy columns. In those innings he felt the comfort of numbers that meant only themselves. He dozed, woke, and felt. Grateful he could reach for water without wires attached to his arms. When the end came in 1994, it came the way he had expected for months, quietly, under a doctor's care, without drama, without a last-minute speech. Lung cancer did what years of stress hadn't been able to do. He was 68. The obituaries summarized him as a Bonanno soldier, a mentor to an undercover agent, a defendant in a case that changed how law enforcement approached organized crime. They mentioned the nickname and the 2 guns. They described the quiet way he collected, the gambling debts that drove him to chase money harder than he might have otherwise, the Florida trip that nearly ended a life. They did not list the small favors he had done for friends or the notes he had written from a prison library table. That's how obituaries work. They fit complicated lives into a few inches of type. He didn't live to see the film, but the movie arrived a few years later and cemented an image of him that would outlast people who had known his voice. On screen, he became a bundle of habits, old-school manners, short temper cooled by loyalty, a gambler's hunger, a collector's patience. Some details were true, others reworked for drama. That's the bargain with stories the public hears. They get a portrait that captures a likeness, even if the painter takes liberties. The real man moved through bars that didn't have perfect lighting, through meetings that didn't end with neat lines, through days in which most of the work looked like errands. He had believed the rules he followed would keep him safe. In the end, the rule that mattered most was the one he had taught others and failed to apply once. Whatever you think you know about the person across the table, you might be wrong. His legacy inside the world he called home was cautionary but not contemptuous. Men who had watched how he handled himself remembered him as steady, sometimes stubborn, often generous within the code he followed, and absolutely committed to not telling tales when pressure hit hardest. Outside that world, his name became shorthand for a moment when the wall between law enforcement and the Mafia cracked wide open. Both views hold pieces of the truth. Neither one owns it completely. The full picture lives in the ordinary scenes. A man in a plain jacket collecting an envelope on a Thursday, a mentor correcting a younger man's tie before a sit-down, a gambler staring at a racing form and promising himself this time he would walk away after the second race. After he was gone, the neighborhoods he had helped animate kept moving. The Motion Lounge had long closed. New tenants built new lives in apartments that once housed people who talked in code. Children grew up hearing the word Brasco as a movie title rather than a secret. Law classes assigned the case as a turning point in RICO history. Journalists traced lines from those years to later prosecutions. Somewhere, a kid in a city learned to keep his mouth shut and his debts paid, and someone older told him there are smarter ways to make a living now. That, too, is part of the story he left behind. He would not have wanted eulogies thick with moralizing. He would have preferred plain talk. He made choices. He earned money in illegal ways that hurt people. He stayed loyal to men who would not or could not save him when the wind turned. He accepted punishment. He tried late in life to be kinder inside the small radius he could still influence. He died as he had lived most days, without a spotlight, carrying himself as if the room were full of people he had to face tomorrow. The rest, books, films, headlines, belongs to the world that writes final drafts. His draft was the one he wrote in ashtrays and notebooks, in envelopes and quiet rules, in the patience of a collector who believed that persistence, more than loudness, defines a man. After he was gone, the trail he left didn't fade. It shifted form. His voice lived on in tape boxes labeled with dates and locations, in transcripts where pauses shared space with numbers, in court exhibits that professors used to teach young lawyers how routine can equal conspiracy when it repeats long enough. People who had never set foot in Williamsburg knew his cadence from excerpts played in classrooms. Detectives fresh out of the academy learned to read a bookmaker's week by listening to how he scheduled pickups. Reporters quoted bits of his small talk because those bits revealed systems. Who took a piece of coin-op machines, how a Shylock calendar breathed, why a bar that looked quiet could serve as a hub for a neighborhood economy that never filed taxes. The man who once brushed lint off a kid's collar became an example in PowerPoints built for grand juries. What emerged clearly was the scope of his illegal work. He booked sports wagers using a network of runners and phones, set lines in step with Las Vegas while making local adjustments, and balanced sheets so that the house profit held even when favorites covered. He lent cash at rates no bank would touch, stacked interest weekly, and kept borrowers on a short leash with reminders that sounded like courtesy until a deadline neared. He took protection from night spots and corner shops under the label of security, meaning problems stayed away because people with problems didn't want trouble with him. He helped move stolen jewelry rings, chains, bracelets, watches because it turned into cash quickly, required no paperwork, and traveled in a coat pocket. He claimed slots for vending machines and jukeboxes in bars so coins poured into his crew's route rather than into public ledgers. He carried guns without permits, not to chase drama, but to avoid being the only man unarmed in a room where tempers had a way of rising when money went missing. He enforced debts with presence more than bruises, showing up daily, sitting, letting silence push a debtor toward payment. He stepped into conspiracy talks when rivals blocked profit lanes, weighing options that included permanent solutions if all else failed. None of this looked cinematic in the moment. It looked like hours, patience, lists, and a left-handed pen scratching names and numbers that had to add up by Thursday. He didn't invent the wheel he rolled. He learned it from older hands who had come up when numbers games ran under cops' noses and union clout-shaped delivery schedules across the city. The thing he added was steadiness. He kept schedules even when gambling losses punched a hole in his week. He wore the same jackets season after season, nursed the same cigarette brand, and trained younger guys with the same rules he had drilled into himself. The Two Guns nickname stuck not because of wild shootouts but because double-blow checking every risk felt like common sense to him. He always had a backup, another piece, another route, another phone, another plan if a meeting spot suddenly looked wrong. That brand of caution is boring to watch. It's also why he lasted. The public version of his life telescoped around the undercover saga, but a fuller view showed a long build. He had paid fines and done short county stretches for gambling charges years before the big RICO case. He had been shaken down by patrol cops who knew his face, and by detectives who figured jailing him for a weekend would nudge him off a block. He had shrugged, called a lawyer, and walked back to work on Monday. That rhythm created the illusion that the system would always treat his crimes as low priority. Then, federal prosecutors sharpened RICO into a tool that linked small acts into an enterprise and turned repetition into gravity. He landed in that gravity because his whole identity rested on reliable repetition. Inside his crew, he did more than collect. He kept a room calm. He solved little arguments before they turned into problems that would require senior attention. He made sure tribute moved upward at the right pace and corrected anyone who thought skimming was a smart way to buy a new car. He scouted opportunities, not by dreaming up flashy scams, but by reading the people who ran bars, who ran trucks, who ran the register behind a counter. If a man looked tired and stressed on a Tuesday afternoon, that man might take a loan. If a supplier complained about delays, that supplier might pay to speed deliveries. If a bar owner grumbled about vandalism, that owner might agree to a security partner. No insurance company could list by name. He tuned his ear to those tells the way a horse player watches ankles at the paddock. His gambling habit, a lifelong itch, shaped a lot of those moves. Good weeks fed debt payments. Bad weeks demanded new cash. That push and pull explains his urgency in finding fresh lanes when old ones slowed. It also explains his patience with young earners who stumbled. He understood compulsion, so he took a long view when a runner lost money, or when a junior man blew a score on a flashy purchase. He'd scold, then redirect, then set clearer terms. He didn't mistake lenience for weakness. Patience ended abruptly if someone made the crew look foolish. The family war that ended with 3 capos gone carved a dividing line. He had stood with his captain and watched friends become names you whispered about rather than mentioned. After that, he carried responsibility differently. He reminded everyone in earshot to keep voices down, to use payphones that didn't click, to change routines if a car showed up. Twice in a row on the same corner. He wasn't imagining heat. Law enforcement had grown more sophisticated. Agents sat on stoops with coffee like anyone else, blended into traffic, and learned the differences between social clubs that mattered and coffee shops that didn't. He knew cameras rarely blinked anymore. He adjusted, yet even careful people leave trails when the job requires daily contact with a broad web of runners, bettors, borrowers, and owners. His mentorship of the eager jewel guy who turned out to be an agent now reads like a parable told in training rooms. He put the newcomer through practical tests. Produce quality goods, stay calm when pressed, show up on time, don't puff. He explained etiquette at sit-downs, the point of pauses, the rule about not speaking first. He modeled how to keep a captain's trust with steady envelopes. Those same lessons created clear audio for prosecutors. The tapes caught the rhythms of a working crew, not staged boasts. Jurors didn't hear a wild man. They heard a teacher describing percentages, schedules, where to stand, when to leave a table. In the end, the traits that made him effective became the evidence that removed him from the street. After his death, the people who had known him split into 2 camps when they told stories. One group emphasized warmth within the circle. The man who remembered a bartender's mother's name, who bought holiday gifts that fit exactly, who slid a little cash to a guy going through divorce without making him ask twice. The other group emphasized consequences. Borrowers who stayed nervous for months. Shop owners who lost margins to envelopes. Rivals who disappeared after vetoing a move one time too many. Both views can sit together. He believed neighborhood order depended on people like him. Many neighbors believed their peace of mind depended on not catching his eye when they walked down the block. The film that eventually dramatized the undercover years gave him a kind of immortality he hadn't asked for. Audiences met a version of him that leaned into loyalty and frustrated pride. He became a teacher whose student walked him into disaster. The script condensed timelines, polished scenes, and turned backroom grit into dialogue that carried meaning for people who had never watched a bookmaker settle a Sunday night. Some of it reflected the man closely. Some of it bent reality to fit a 2-hour arc. The constant through all portrayals was this. He carried himself with a craftsman's seriousness. He treated illegal work like a trade you did properly or not at all. Investigators who worked the case later talked about how they used his methods to train new teams. They taught agents to blend patience with low-wiki persistence. They highlighted how daily, unglamorous contacts, quick pickups, phone calls after games, small meetings in diners produced the strongest evidence under racketeering law. They pointed to his insistence on precise timetables as the thing that made tapes especially compelling. You hear a due date, you see a payment, you get a pattern. The pattern shows an enterprise. In that way, he helped define the shape of modern organized crime prosecutions, even as he fought them. He also indirectly reshaped the Bonanno path. The infiltration embarrassed leaders, forced internal audits of trust, and triggered old-style punishments. Leadership changed, alliances reset, and a new caution took root. Crews moved their hubs from obvious social clubs to fronts that resembled normal businesses. Bookmaking narrowed, took advantage of offshore lines, and adopted burner phones with brief lifespans. Loan operations folded into semi-legitimate firms that used contracts as covers. Fencing of stolen jewelry slowed as retailers adopted better tracking, and as buyers demanded cleaner provenance. The racket didn't vanish. It adjusted. People in that world started using his story as a warning when a newcomer impressed them too quickly. He had never been a boss. He was a soldier with a long resume and a clear sense of his place in the chain. That role often gets misunderstood by outsiders. Soldiers don't make policy. They make policy work in daily practice. His value came from reliability under pressure. not from visionary schemes. He kept peace in a room, kept money flowing uphill, kept juniors from saying something stupid in front of seniors. That kind of contribution doesn't headline, it sustains. The flip side is that when lightning strikes, soldiers absorb the shock. They go down first, do the time, return older if they return at all. He knew that bargain, and still signed every day with his presence. If there was a through line from his youth to his last months, it was the belief that a man's word is the last thing he controls. He stayed quiet when deals were offered that would have shortened his sentence in exchange for naming names or filling in gaps in a prosecutor's timeline. He had reasons rooted in pride, kinship, and identity. He also had a practical angle. People who cooperate often live under new roofs with new names. A kind of exile he didn't want. He preferred the straight pain of a sentence to the crooked daily anxiety of a life built on a state's guarantee. That choice cost him years. It also protected the way he saw himself. Some myths still cling to his name. People claim he brokered massive narcotics deals. Evidence points instead to steady gambling, loans, extortion, fencing, and enterprise conspiracies that included planned violence but not wholesale drug rings. Others claim he climbed near the top. He didn't. He remained a working soldier with respected mentors, close to a captain who trusted him. Another myth asserts that he hated the agent who deceived him. In truth, people close to him say his strongest emotion was not rage but a weary acceptance, that he had been beaten by a professional playing a long game, an outcome he would have respected in another context. He'd have rather lost to skill than to luck. His neighborhoods changed, but the kind of watchfulness he practiced survives in different corners of the city. Small businesses still weigh who to trust with deliveries. Owners still pay for peace in ways they'd rather not describe. Gamblers still chase losses and pay prices. Where his legacy bites hardest is in the buyer's remorse of people drawn to the promise of quick cash. They read about him, watch a dramatization, and realize that even the smoothest operator ends up choosing between a cell and a hospital bed while bills arrive either way. For some, that's enough to step off the path. For others, the lure remains. Human nature doesn't retire. The people who loved him remember him as stubborn and funny, generous within limits, excited by a good sauce and a tight ball game, tired of his own habits but too attached to them to quit. The people he pressured remember him as a shadow in a doorway and a soft voice that insisted on deadlines. The law remembers him as a voice on tapes that helped tie a set of practices to a legal theory that still holds. The culture remembers him as a character in a story told again and again because it hits the drama spine. Audiences recognize loyalty, betrayal, consequences, and a code that protects and destroys in equal measure. If you strip away all the noise, what's left is a worker who treated an outlaw economy like a job, clocked in with envelopes and cigarettes, trained a junior who wasn't who he said he was, ignored health warnings until it was too late, and died quieter than the headlines that had used his name. He didn't collect trophies. He collected due dates. He didn't chase fame. He chased balance in a ledger that refused to stay balanced. He didn't preach. He offered rules meant to keep a person breathing in rooms where breathing requires skill. In the end, those rules save no one from the largest truths. The law learns, the body gives out, and the city forgets if you stop reminding it that you're here. On some nights, the old Motion Lounge block still hums in the memory of people who knew it. You can almost hear a kid getting coached on how to answer a question with a nod, a bookmaker muttering lines under his breath, a collector taking a slow sip of coffee while a borrower counts. Somewhere on that block, a left-handed man checks his watch, flicks ash, and decides it's time to move along. That's the picture most faithful to who he was. Not a myth, not a cautionary sermon, just a slice of New York taken at street level, where money changes hands and promises keep the lights on until they don't. People still argue about when the story truly turned. Some say it was the afternoon he stood up to a louder man over who controlled a young earner's envelopes. Others pick the day a Florida plan crossed a line and ended under a federal spotlight. For him, the turn felt slower, like a fall that starts with a small slip. He had been making money the same way for years. Take bets, lend cash, collect on time, sell jewelry that came through side doors, claim a slice from machines in dim corners. That routine kept him useful. It also meant he touched a lot of people every week, and every touch made a record in someone's mind. In the end, those records spooled on tape, scribbled in notebooks, remembered by men in suits, built the case that set the last chapter of his life. Go back to the beginning of the apprenticeship that tipped everything. The kid with the jewel bag didn't rush at the start. He listened, asked decent questions, and kept his voice even. Lefty measured him over coffee after coffee. He talked through the unwritten rules the way a carpenter teaches a new hand to square a frame. You keep the room calm. You don't answer a question you weren't asked. You never show impatience with a captain. You don't boast in front of civilians. You pay debts faster than you spend winnings. You arrive early and leave before the room empties. He believed the rules kept you alive. The kid nodded, absorbed, waited. Lefty took pride in teaching because he remembered the older men who had pulled him aside decades earlier and corrected his stance at a table. He wanted to do that for somebody else and be remembered for competence rather than flash. Daily life did not look dramatic. On Mondays and Thursdays, he would work a Shylock route, coffee in hand, a short list folded in his pocket. He'd sit, exchange greetings, and let silence make the point about due dates. He almost never raised his voice. He didn't need to. The borrower remembered the last time payments fell behind and how quickly appointments multiplied. On weekends, he'd check in on bets. Some bettors made him laugh with their theories. Some made him nervous with their delusions. He liked disciplined customers who understood limits. He disliked gamblers who chased an impossible Sunday night rescue. He recognized himself in the second kind, more than he admitted. That recognition fueled empathy some days and hard lines on others. The ducks in a row, he would stop by a bar where his crew had a stake in the machines. The owner would mention a small issue someone knew hanging around, a delivery arriving late, a rumor about a rival asking questions. Lefty treated every comment as a clue. He filed it alongside who sat where and who started showing up in a different car. A lot of his value came from reading rooms like that. If a stranger's tone sounded wrong, he found out who sent him. If a guy started flashing money he didn't have last month, he learned whether it came from a new hustle or a mistake. He solved little puzzles before they turned into bigger ones. That kept older men from having to step in, and staying off a boss's calendar was its own form of safety. He met theft where it crossed his desk. Jewelry flowed because it was compact, mobile, and easy to convert back into cash without leaving a trail anyone could find with a quick search. He didn't sit at home with schematics for a heist. He let fences and professional thieves bring him what they had. He provided a market and took a margin. The practice didn't require shouting, it required reputation. If people trusted you to turn items into cash without making problems worse, they came back. If a piece looked too hot, you said no, and that no carried weight because you didn't say it often. He made those calls with a left-handed flip of a magnifier and a careful look at settings and weight. He didn't pretend he was in the diamond district. He respected the people who were. The symbolic weight of being in meant a lot to him. He had not been born into riches. The organization gave him standing he wouldn't have found in a legitimate office. He liked knowing where he sat on the chain and what he owed upward. He liked teaching a younger man how to act in rooms that tested composure. When he talked about the ceremony that awaited the apprentice, a kind of pride softened his voice that he rarely displayed otherwise. He pictured himself standing nearby when the younger man crossed into full membership. That image kept him moving on days when gambling losses nagged, and arguments over credit lines felt endless. The Tony Mira dispute felt like sand under his shoes for months. It started as a question of who introduced whom, and matured into a fight about who deserved the income that flowed through an associate. In their world, introductions mattered, but stewardship mattered more. Lefty argued he had done the work, taught the rules, opened doors, kept heat low, carried any blowback from mistakes. He didn't settle the matter with a threat. He kept bringing in money and letting that result speak for him. When the tide turned in his favor, he enjoyed the win quietly, without gloating. In his line of work, gloating is a flare. The Three a Capo killing in 1981 re-etched lines overnight. He had been living through rumors about splits for months. The morning after, people who had laughed at the bar a week earlier were just gone. He did what he always did when the ground shifted. He conserved movement, shortened sentences, and made sure his steps didn't sound like echoes. He kept reporting upward with envelopes. He told the younger man to read eyes, not words. Under stress, People show what they really think in their faces, not in their speeches. That advice had value in those weeks when nobody knew where loyalties truly Saturday. Florida had felt like a bright lane, new bars, tourists with loose wallets, and owners who recognized the value of a silent partner no visitor needed to know about. They moved in careful, keeping conversations friendly, offering help where help would be seen as relief rather than invasion. The pushback was real. Local power didn't bend easily. Meetings filled with polite phrases but sharp edges ended with promises to figure it out. Planning sessions in hotel rooms followed. He wasn't a planner by temperament for the worst option, but he knew why that option got airtime when profits jammed. If talk fails and an obstacle won't move, people in his world consider a fix with finality. That's what the tapes later captured. Quiet voices laying out possibilities. Agents chose that moment to close in. The arrests that followed replaced a night nobody could take back with court calendar entries. When the Bureau rolled up the undercover mission and told newspapers what they had been doing, the shock felt like gravity pounded into a room. Lefty had vouched for the agent. He had set him on a path toward the inner circle because the man made money and kept his cool. Learning that everything had been recorded did more than damage his case. It hit his identity. He had built pride on reading people well. Getting fooled by an expert stung. He didn't spit blame. He accepted that he had lost a match to someone who practiced deception for a living. That acceptance didn't keep consequences from arriving. He prepared himself for the call that usually ends a man. When it came, he acted like someone who had watched this happen to others. He put his things in order at home, kept his goodbyes short, and started walking. Agents caught up before he reached the door he had been told to enter. They arrested him on racketeering counts that stitched together years of routine. Illegal betting, extortion framed as security, high-interest loans, unlicensed firearms, fencing jewelry, and involvement in a plan to take a life. He was not shocked by the list. He recognized every line. He had chosen each step years earlier. He took the cuffs with a calm that said he had rehearsed the moment in his head. The trial made him into a voice in a courtroom. Jurors heard him explain the simple arithmetic of a Shylock week and the philosophy of collecting without breaking everything in sight. They heard him explain that fear travels faster when you don't shout. The prosecutors stacked tapes and records until routine looked like a map. The defense pointed out that men talk big in back rooms to keep younger guys in line. That argument looked thin against calendars, ledgers, and phone logs. The verdict brought the expected sentence. He started counting time. He carried his habits inside. Keep your space clean. Keep your ties loose to loudmouths. Keep your head down. Keep your mind busy. He found a way to anchor days with harmless tasks. He walked laps like a metronome. He wrote letters that sounded wiser than the lectures he gave in bars. He told his children to pick boring paths that let you sleep at night. He cut down back-and-forth with anyone who wanted him to tell the old stories for entertainment. He had no desire to perform a myth when the cost of that myth had stopped being theoretical. His health bent his schedule. Coughs turned into diagnoses. Doctors marked charts. He kept a straight face, even when breathing felt like a job. He took release when it was offered, because he preferred bad news in a chair by a window to bad news under buzzers. He returned to a city that had modernized into another language. He obeyed rules because rules now protected him from a last, exhausting mistake. He found comfort in small rituals, fresh coffee, a clean shirt, an early appointment kept exactly as promised. After he died, people tried to draw lessons. Some saw a warning about trusting too easily. Others saw a study in loyalty pushed past the point where self-interest would have recommended a turn. Some focused on his work as a collector and teacher within a crew, and called him a craftsman of an illicit trade. Most agreed on one thing. His story became a hinge in a larger history. The point where law enforcement proved it could live inside a crew long enough to understand it from the inside out. That proof changed both sides of the equation. Crews learned to fear their own patience. Agents learned to treat small talk like evidence. A fair account of his criminal record doesn't need garnish. He participated in bookmaking over many years. He coordinated bets, kept ledgers, and earned from spreads. He extended loans at rates outlawed by statute and enforced repayment through pressure. He collected protection money that bought influence, not receipts. He moved stolen jewelry through a network built on trust rather than contracts. He claimed a cut from machine routes that put cash into his crew's pockets. He kept illegal firearms for self-protection in a world where no one else arrived unarmed. He stepped into conversations about removing rivals when money streams jammed. He did all of this without staging scenes for attention. His method was steadiness. That steadiness is why so many hours of tape sounded the same, and therefore convinced jurors that what they heard wasn't performance but policy. Strip away the newspaper font, and you get a man who took pride in consistency and paid dearly for it when consistency became the core of a conspiracy case. He had opportunities to trade information for mercy. He said no because saying yes would have reduced him to a person he didn't recognize. Whether that choice looks noble or stubborn depends on where you stand. In his world, it looked like keeping the one promise you can still keep when most choices have been taken away. The undercover saga overshadowed everything, but other threads mattered to people who knew him. He could be thoughtful in small ways, remembering an old friend's sister's name, sending holiday cash to a man who had once gone down quietly without asking for favors, telling a junior earner to buy a cheaper car, and get used to showing restraint. He could be hard when he thought someone's sloppiness put the room at risk. He could be funny in a pinch and say nothing for an hour, if silence kept the peace. He believed dignity lived in the way you carried yourself, even when handcuffed. That belief is why he shaved for court and kept his shoes polished, as if presentation were the last tool a man could count on. People sometimes ask whether he regretted teaching the agent so well. The answer lives in the way he handled the truth when it came out. He didn't lash out at a ghost. He accepted that he had been outplayed by someone who understood patience at a professional level. He blamed himself for violating a rule he had hammered into others. If a man impresses you too quickly, ask yourself why. That self-reproach wasn't melodrama. It was the straightforward kind that doesn't require a confession booth. His death didn't tidy the story. It left questions about what might have happened if the agent had not been pulled when he was, about whether a ceremony would have followed, about whether the Florida plan would have gone forward or fallen apart. Those questions keep authors busy. They don't change the ledger. He lived as a soldier in a crime family, committed crimes that funded that family, mentored a man who recorded the lessons, refused to cooperate when charged, served time, came home sick, and died 2 years later. The simplicity of that line is part of what draws people to it. The choices are clear, the consequences logical, the ironies sharp. If you want to understand why his name still gets spoken in rooms far from Brooklyn, think about how his steadiness made him legible. Most people have met a version of him, a supervisor who kept order without bluster, a coach who cared more about form than flash, a neighborhood figure who knew everyone and preferred deals to scenes. Put that person into an illegal economy, and you get a character who can carry a story because he feels real. He was not a mastermind. He was a craftsman. He maintained a system others had built. When the system cracked, he absorbed the break like a beam that snaps last. The neighborhoods that raised him don't look the same. Social clubs have thinned, loud jukeboxes replaced by playlists, and back rooms by private chats on apps. Yet the old dynamics flicker in new forms. Someone still takes a cut for making a problem go away. Someone still pushes money into hands that can't get it at a bank. Someone still bets too much on teams that can't cover. The caution attached to his name whispers across those habits. A steady hustle can run for years, but repetition leaves tracks. The same traits that make you effective make you traceable. He learned that late, and by then the learning arrived as a sentence. Remember him in the plainest light. A left-handed man in a simple jacket, calm voice, careful eyes, who believed in rules that had kept him alive. He taught those rules to a student who wrote them down in a way he never expected. He lost a bet he didn't know he placed. He carried himself with composure when the house collected. He spent his final seasons trying to be decent to the few people still within reach. The rest, the novels, scripts, and heated debates will keep circling. The life beneath them doesn't change. It sits there, as solid as a bar stool, telling anyone who wants to listen that loyalty without caution is a trap, that skill without humility invites defeat, and that in the long run, the city always learns your habits if you repeat them enough. Years later, the places where his name showed up had nothing to do with a bar stool or a back room. It lived in film credits, casebooks, and the memories of people who still saw him as the man who kept a room steady. The contrast between what crowds believed and what those close to him knew never quite closed. On screens, He became a symbol of loyalty, tested to the breaking point. In files, he remained a sequence of counts tied to a federal statute that turned routine into a net. In private stories, he was the guy who taught you to straighten your tie before you walked into a room where words carried weight. All those versions can exist side by side without canceling one another. He had that kind of life, clear lines, heavy costs, a little tenderness where you might not expect it. The fact list is not glamorous, but it is solid. He was born in 1926, grew up near corners where rackets ran in plain sight, and learned early that consistency beat drama. He attached himself to the Bonanno family as an associate and, later, a soldier. He worked under Dominic "Sonny Black" Napolitano, a captain who favored steady earners over loud gestures. He learned from older men that gambling, lending, extortion dressed up as security, and fencing small valuables could feed a crew without drawing early headlines. He ran books on sports, set numbers, balanced sheets, and nudged bettors toward moves that helped the house. He loaned money at illegal rates and enforced schedules with presence and patience. He took weekly tributes from shops that preferred quiet to uncertainty. He bought and sold stolen rings and watches because they changed hands quickly and didn't fill a trunk with evidence. He held a stake in routes for coin-op machines. He carried guns without permits because in his world that counted as common sense. He stepped into planning talks for violent solutions when rivals blocked cash lanes. Those habits make up the working record of his criminal life. They also explain why tapes of simple conversations turned into anchors for a racketeering case. The undercover chapter still carries the strongest pull. An agent calling himself Donnie worked his way into his orbit through Tony Mira. Lefty measured him with questions that sounded like small talk but carried tests inside. The kid passed enough of them to stick. Lefty taught him how to behave at a table where a pause can mean more than a sentence. He brought him into Sonny Black's circle, vouched for him when doubts flickered, defended his claim when Mira tried to reclaim the relationship, and pushed for a seat that very few outsiders ever got to touch. The undercover mission ended because the Bureau saw a line approaching that it could not let the agent cross. The abrupt extraction left Sonny Black exposed to consequences inside the family. He disappeared. Not long after, Tony Mira, blamed for opening a door that should have stayed shut, was killed months later. Lefty was expected to answer for his role too. Agents arrested him before he walked into a meeting that likely would have ended him. In film, he walks toward a closed door. In life, he went to federal court, not a grave. He faced charges that fit the ledger he had kept in his head for years. Prosecutors under RICO listed illegal gambling, loan sharking, extortion in the name of security, trafficking in stolen jewelry, firearms violations, and conspiracy tied to Florida talks about removing an obstacle. The case did not rely on a single dramatic witness. It leaned on repetition, tapes where he broke down percentages, phone logs that mirrored his schedules, ledgers that matched voices, and co-I defendants whose testimony lined up with the routine the tapes captured. He refused to cooperate, took the verdict, and went to prison. He spent close to a decade inside, grew ill, won release late on medical grounds, and died of lung cancer in 1994, at 60 weight. That is the simple arc, the one you can tell in a minute. The thicker version runs through neighborhoods that shaped him. Brooklyn and Lower Manhattan taught him that backroom order can govern a block more efficiently than any posted rule. He was not a mythic figure. He was a worker who understood the architecture of fear and favor. He counted on the psychology of showing up. He had a talent for seeing angles in ordinary chatter, and a knack for flattening a dispute before it grew wings. He believed there was honor in keeping promises within his system, even when that system harmed people who never signed up for it. That belief is hard to explain to those who never needed to weigh protection money against a smashed window or a delivery that might not arrive on time. For all the talk about codes, money set the pace. His habit at the track created holes that business had to fill, chasing losses, then covering them with fresh earnings, then starting over again. Those cycles powered many of his decisions. Debt, even inside a crew, speaks louder than speeches. He kept pressure on himself the same way he kept pressure on his borrowers. Quiet, constant, without theatrics. That drive to stay square upstream explains why he pushed for new lanes in Florida and why he tolerated riskier conversations when local pushback made polite deals look pointless. The family war that took out 3 capos in 1981 marks a pivot in any history of his era. He had backed his captain and lived through the reshuffle. After that day, he carried a new level of caution. He warned younger men to watch faces more than words, and to assume that any room could be listening. He adjusted routines, used public phones when he could, varied schedules when a car appeared twice. Even so, habits create grooves, and the undercover mission made use of those grooves. By the time the Bureau pulled the plug, the case had more than enough threads. What did he teach that others still repeat? Not instructions on how to break laws, but small rules about carrying yourself. Arrive early, speak less, dress clean, pay attention to who is comfortable in a room and who isn't. Those lessons translate to environments far from his world. They also explain why his tapes felt so steady to jurors. They recorded a teacher explaining workplace basics, not a braggart improvising. The very thing he considered his craft explaining routines turned into the clearest evidence of an ongoing enterprise. Accuracy matters when people talk about him through the filter of art. The movie got the feeling right in places, the affection that builds between an older mentor and a younger earner, the controlled calm that masks a hard life, the way pride takes a hit when trust breaks. It bent facts to fit a cleaner arc. In reality, he didn't walk into a final meeting and vanish. The government intervened. He didn't carry a permanent grudge in public. He accepted that he had been outmaneuvered by someone who made deception a profession. That distinction doesn't make for a neat final scene, but it fits the man who counted his steps and tried not to waste energy on what he couldn't fix. If you list his crimes plainly, you get the record he carried. Illegal bookmaking across many seasons, coordinating bets and balances, loans that broke legal limits, enforcing those loans with pressure and the implied threat of worse, extracting regular payments from businesses under the label of protection, converting stolen jewelry into cash, holding unlicensed firearms, joining in discussions to end a rival's interference in Florida. These are not rumors. They are the backbone of indictments, testimony, and recordings. Add to that lesser brushes, short arrests for gambling and weapons before the big case, and you have a consistent pattern that lasted into his 50s. The outcomes for the men around him draw a grim map. Sonny Black trusted and paid. Tony Mira insisted and paid. Others who surfaced in those years took deals, moved away under new identities, or stayed and learned fresh caution under new leadership. The Bonanno organization, badly hurt by the undercover exposure, eventually rebuilt pieces of its standing under different bosses, only to face new federal attention later. In that sense, his era sits between 2 waves. The last years when social clubs openly set the rhythm of a street, and the years when crews shifted under tighter surveillance, tighter money, and a culture that didn't value neighborhood presence the way it once had. Family is the quiet thread people outside the life rarely see. He had children and grandchildren who remember a man who tried late to show up in ordinary ways, a call on a birthday, a small gift, a visit scheduled between treatments. Their view is not built from headlines. It is built from chairs pulled closer during a holiday, and the steady voice of a father who had learned the hard way that excitement burns down a life faster than boredom. He did not rewrite his past for them. He acknowledged damage and tried to do less of it with the time left. That doesn't erase what came before. It gives the end a measure of grace. Why does the story hold attention decades later? Because it sits at the crossroads of 3 human preoccupations: loyalty, deception, and consequence. People want to believe they can read character. He did too. He trusted that skill, then suffered when it failed him against a trained adversary. People want to believe that following rules, any rules, provides safety. He followed his code, then learned that a different set of rules, written in statute books, would decide his fate. People want to believe that work, done well, earns respect. He worked steadily, taught carefully, and still watched his craft turned into exhibit numbers. That tension keeps the story alive beyond the specifics of any single crime scene. There's a quiet lesson baked into how his name is used now. Law students hear him as a voice that anchors racketeering lectures. Investigators hear him as proof that patient, low-drama infiltration works. Filmmakers hear him as a character whose contradictions feel human. People who grew up near those blocks hear him as a caution. A steady hand can steer you through a lot. but it can't steer around time, surveillance, or the bill that comes due when a system's habits finally meet a system built to catalog them. Imagine him on a winter morning, older, breath thin, jacket zipped to the chin, picking a path that avoids crowds. He stops for coffee, thanks the kid behind the counter, and steps back outside to a city that no longer runs on signals he recognizes. He doesn't complain, he keeps moving. That image contains everything you need to know. He was his habits. They served him, trapped him, defined him, and, in the end, explained him to strangers who never shared a table. If you crave a moral, keep it simple. He chose a life that paid in cash and cost in years. He believed in a code that granted structure and demanded silence. He carried out crimes that harmed people, even when harm arrived softly. He mentored a man who wasn't what he seemed and accepted the fallout without pleading for a special rule. He served time, came home sick, tried to be decent in small ways, and died quietly. No speeches, no last scene cleaned for the camera. Just a man who had lived by repetition, learning that repetition had become a record. The last word belongs to the ordinary. Somewhere, a bar closes, and a worker counts a drawer while the radio murmurs. Somewhere, a better promises that next week will be different. Somewhere, an older man teaches a younger one to take a breath before he answers. Those are the moments he would recognize. That's the scale that fit him best. Strip away the noise, and you can still see him at a corner table, left hand around a cup, eyes reading the room, carrying on as if tomorrow were guaranteed, knowing, deep down, it never was. And that brings us to the end of tonight's story from the Silent Empires. Lefty Ruggiero here, thanking you for joining me on this quiet walk through loyalty, friendship, and the passing of an old way of life. If this story helped you unwind tonight, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and join our family for more stories of gangsters and forgotten empires. Share your city and the time you're listening in the comments. I always enjoy seeing where these stories reach. Until next time, may the silence of the empire watch over your rest, and may the echoes of history carry you gently into sleep. Good night.